welcome you to the inaugural DH at Wake Speaker Series event with Dr. Kenneth Price. I am Carrie Johnston, the Digital Humanities Research Designer here at DSR Library. As a part of the Digital Initiatives and Scholarly Communication Group, I work with my team on planning digital humanities events, this being one of them, and stay tuned for future DH at Wake lectures, institutes, and workshops. I'd like to thank the co-sponsors of this event, the Department of English and DSR Library's Special Collections and Archives Unit. Immediately following our talk, the Special Collections and Archives has organized a pop-up exhibit, which is upstairs in 625 in the Special Collections Reading Room. We've got Walt Whitman things on display, and we also have refreshments provided by the English department. So thank you to our co-sponsors. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Kenneth Price, who joins us from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he is the Hillegas University Professor of American Literature and the co-director of the Center for Digital Research in the Humanities. His talk, titled Many Long Dumb Voices Clarified and Transfigured, the Walt Whitman Archive and the Scholarly Edition in the Digital Age, will discuss aspects of his work as co-founder, co-editor, and co-director of the Walt Whitman Archive. Dr. Price is also a collaborator on digital projects such as Civil War Washington and the Charles Chestnut Digital Archive, as well as the author of numerous books and articles on American literature, scholarly editing and digital publishing, and the evolving field of digital humanities. His forthcoming book, Whitman in Washington, Becoming the National Poet in the Federal City, is under contract with Oxford University Press. On a personal note, I'm excited to have Ken here this evening, as I remember encountering his work as a graduate student navigating the world of literary studies in a time that alternately celebrated and dismissed digital humanities. And I found his work and his voice to be an important voice in the conversation of digital humanities. I recall the 2013 MLA panel, The Dark Side of Digital Humanities, which got a ton of press. And then this also other conversation telling all us grad students that digital humanities would save us and to latch on while you could. So amid all of this debate and talk of extremes, I found Ken's work at this time incredibly reasonable, grounding, and groundbreaking. It offered digital resources and increased access to rare materials, as well as insightful commentary on what the digital realm affords us, as well as its limitations. It is an honor to have them here today to speak more on this important work. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kenneth Price.
Many thanks for having me here. It's great to be at Wake Forest. We're here because my wife, Wendy Katz, is a fellow at the Ronaldo House this year. It's a wonderful opportunity for her, and I tagged along for the ride. Enjoying to get to know Winston-Salem, playing tennis on clay courts, first time in a long time. It's a lot of fun. Well, let me echo the thanks to the English department and the Special Collections and to the Digital Initiative, and especially to Carrie for having me today. Also thanks to Meredith Farmer for forcing her class into coming. Appreciate that. And let me say that, particularly for the students, if you have a question, if something I say is just odd or strange or seemingly touching on something that you worry is obvious but you don't get at all, go ahead and ask that question, because that's probably the fundamental thing that's really important, that is getting at the root of some profound issue in digital humanities and editing and the kinds of things that we're trying to do with the Whitman Archive. So I'd be happy to field the obvious question. All right, so what does it mean to edit Walt Whitman's writings in our time? The question sounds straightforward, though by the end of the talk, I hope that the terms edit, Whitman, and writings all seem complicated, perhaps even fraught. I mention in our time because scholarly efforts, our opportunities and constraints, are shaped profoundly by the given historical moment. I will comment on editing in the age of the digital archive and the rise of so-called big data, emphasize the importance of hearing multiple voices within Whitman, thereby highlighting the collaborative creation of many of his writings, and discuss why our desire to create an all-inclusive resource by no means puts to rest the question of what counts as being part of all. Turning away from the common depiction of Whitman as a modernist solitary genius, I will stress his role as a collaborative, creative force. That, anyway, is the Whitman I think we are creating at the Walt Whitman Archive. This relatively new genre in which we work is variously called a digital thematic research collection, a digital archive, a database, and a knowledge site. It's a genre with new capacities only now being tested through projects ranging from the Willa Cather Archive to the Digital Archive of Fernando Pessoa's Book of Disquiet to the Colored Conventions Project. A digital archive, almost always collaborative in nature, may have at its core a scholarly edition, as the Whitman Archive does. Let's see. Get this to work. Respond. It was responding earlier. There we go. But its function and purposes are likely to differ from a scholarly edition, if only because of its capacity for greater inclusiveness. In our work at the Walt Whitman Archive, we strive to have the most scholarly usefulness for Whitman studies and cultural studies more broadly. Studying Whitman is challenging because he left behind an enormous amount of written material, and his life's work, Leaves of Grass, went through 6 very different editions, each of which was issued in a number of formats. The result is a book that is probably best studied as numerous distinct creations rather than as a single revised work. His many notebooks, manuscript fragments, prose essays, letters, and newspaper articles all offer key cultural and biographical context for his poetry. For our digital archive, we also include a great deal of content rarely seen in traditional print editions, including an annotated bibliography of all criticism of Whitman from 1839 to the present, currently numbering over 15,000 items, all known photos of the poet, selected recent criticism, all known contemporary reviews, and a great deal of documentation about the history and technological underpinnings of our site. In the past few years, we've also added previously unknown full-length works by Whitman, a health guide for urban men, Manly Health and Training, and a novel, Jack Engel, written just before the emergence of Leaves of Grass. Digital archives are emerging at a time of change both in technological practice and capacities, including the development of so-called Web 2.0, a more interactive experience enabled by writable digital platforms, allowing users to comment on or to contribute to the resources they consult. These developments have led to some initial experimentation in what has been dubbed the social edition. Another key change in the intellectual landscape is the superabundance of available electronic information. Think of Google Books, for example. We need to be able to explain why editing remains relevant in an era when, to the casual observer, it might seem that Google has swept up entire libraries, making all books electronically searchable. How should editorial practices change in such a time? And what opportunities do we have to merge the strengths of editorial projects with mass digitization efforts? There are some intriguing possibilities on this front. For example, I suspect that in the future, more instances of so-called found poetry will be discovered in Leaves of Grass. I expect scholars will discover additional cases of Whitman's poems being drawn from newspaper articles, scientific treatises, and other sources, and then deftly reworked into verse. When we began our work in 1995, before Google Books and other mass digitization projects, the Whitman Archive could take pride in making available all editions of Leaves of Grass. At that time, only a handful of research libraries possessed all 6 editions, so few people could study the development of Whitman's work in a serious fashion. The final deathbed edition of 1892 is very different than the radical experimentation found in 1855. And the many intervening steps from the one to the other are complex. The approach of earlier editors working in print had discouraged the study of temporal development, of the numerous discrete periods within Whitman's writing life, because they favored privileging an author's final intention. In particular, this approach to editing shaped the New York University Press edition, The Collected Writings of Walt Whitman. This edition accomplished a great deal, but we can look in vain within its 25 volumes for a readable version of the 1855 Leaves of Grass. In this case, a respected editorial approach, consistently applied, led to what now seems like an absurd result: the omission of probably Whitman's single greatest achievement and one of the most original books ever written in North America. Unsurprisingly, the 1856, 1860, 1867, and 1872 editions of Leaves of Grass were also inadequately represented by the New York University Press editors, and Whitman's poetry manuscripts, drafts that are highly illuminating about his creative process and purposes, were almost entirely ignored. Of course, now the various editions of Leaves of Grass are available not only on the Whitman Archive, but also scattered here and there in text collections such as Google Books, the Internet Archive, and Project Bartleby. However, as we know, mass digitization projects have created these enormous troves of information, typically by relying on optical character recognition, OCR as it's commonly referred to, an automated means of converting a digital scan or photographic image into machine-readable electronic text. This conversion process is almost always imperfect, and not surprisingly, when the original print quality is poor because of broken fonts, smudging, stains, gaps, or other damage, we get disappointing results, so-called dirty OCR, with a high rate of error. Somewhat insidiously, these errors are not always evident to users when they see a flawless facsimile page image, but perhaps do not realize that underneath the image is a flawed transcription on which the search functionally depends. Smaller projects, digital archives like, say, the William Blake Archive or the Walt Whitman Archive, can achieve much higher levels of accuracy. In our case, we see the scholarly contribution of the Whitman Archive and Digital Humanities to be not only in making accurate texts available and searchable, but also downloadable and open to being repurposed by other projects. We adhere to international standards so that the potential of interoperability may one day be realized. Our contribution in literary studies is partly based on our categorization of and commentary on manuscripts, material left all but untouched by these mass digitization projects. As you know, an editorial project, whether it's on Jane Austen, Goethe, or Beckett, also adds scholarly value through framing commentary in introductions, annotations, and so forth. I will return to our framing commentary later and the challenges it raises with regard to what to prioritize and why. These are complex questions that make us rethink our purposes. Oh, maybe I have mail coming in. Yeah, check out my mail program. Sorry about that. If it goes on, I will shoot it or something. All right. Oh, thanks. Yeah, turn off the volume. That's a good call. All right. All right. But if we step back from the Whitman Archive and think more broadly about digital archives for a moment, we can observe that within the short history of this genre, a key transformation has already occurred. The primary function has shifted from being a locus of access to a locus of study. Consistent with our interest in making a scholarly contribution, we place high priority on what past print treatments of Whitman undervalued. Our procedures rely on a historical or developmental approach to textuality rather than what might be called a frozen monument approach. In contrast to an emphasis on final intentions, the Whitman Archive emphasizes all stages of the documentary record, the totality of what he left us. We make possible the study of documents in various stages of the creative process, highlighting what John Bryant calls fluid text. We have interest in the many versions Whitman left across printed editions, manuscript and notebook drafts, corrected proofs, and periodical printings, and so do not attempt to establish a single definitive text, but instead to prize multiplicity. Our interest in multiple texts is congruent with our interest in multiplicity in authorship. Specifically, we wish to highlight the network of creators so often involved in a Whitman text. The poet himself claimed to make audible many long dumb voices and sung myself. Through me, many long dumb voices, voices of the interminable generations of prisoners and slaves, voices of the diseased and despairing and of thieves and dwarfs, voices of cycles of preparation and accretion, and of the threads that connect the stars, and of wombs, and of the father stuff, and of the rights of them the others are down upon, the deformed, trivial, flat, foolish, despised, fog in the air, beetles rolling balls of dung. Through me, forbidden voices, voices of sexes and lusts, voices veiled and I remove the veil, voices indecent by me clarified and transfigured. Whitman acknowledged the other voices in his own, but the editors of the collected writings of Walt Whitman focused on a single voice in their resolutely author-centered editorial practice. It's probably not accidental that one of the general editors of the collected writings, Gay Wilson Allen, also wrote a biography titled The Solitary Singer. We try, in contrast, to recognize the importance of Whitman as a creator, even while revealing how often his creations had multiple creators. Accordingly, for example, we show and analyze the role of printers via our page images and commentaries. Some of his collaborations with printers are amazing. Most strikingly, perhaps, in the 1860 edition of Leaves of Grass, when the poet of the body infused the very letters of Leaves of Grass with images of sperm. He left no explanation for this choice, but as Ed Folsom notes, he must have thought that his words were the seeds for new ideas, a new nation, a new conception of democracy, and they would need to penetrate readers and fertilize their imaginations. The key point again is collaboration. To achieve his ends, Whitman worked closely with printers employed by the publishers Thayer and Eldridge of Boston. The Whitman Archive also presents both sides of his correspondence, not just the outgoing correspondence, in order to restore the full context and meaning of those exchanges. We also treat Whitman's interviews, his journalism, where his texts live in conversation with other writers around him, the photographs of the poet, studying both photographer and subject, and his marginalia, where Whitman talks back to other writers, both the famous and unknown. Too often in the past, the individual creator has been celebrated at the expense of rendering almost invisible the social elements of production, reception, and transformation as texts come into being and are transmitted and altered across media, across time, and across culture. With regard to correspondence, interviews, journalism, and marginalia, a focus on the author as a solitary creator serves more to distort than to clarify. The same can be said for translations. Forgot to give you the images of the marginalia, which I think are just awesome. But we're all onto translation, so here we go. Since most people in the world first encounter Whitman in a language other than English, we've taken initial steps to better serve a multilingual audience. We currently provide full translations of Leaves of Grass into German, Portuguese, Spanish, and Russian. Translations into Italian, Ukrainian, and Yiddish are in development, and we would love to present work on Whitman in Chinese in the future. This is a Russian and Chinese translation. It's fascinating to see what happens to Whitman when he crosses linguistic and cultural borders and becomes absorbed in another milieu. This interaction often illuminates both the hosting cultural tradition as it comes to terms with Whitman and highlights the emphases and blind spots in how American audiences have interpreted the poet's writings. Translations have rarely featured prominently in scholarly editions, but they can have a key place in a digital archive. A translation, say the first one in Italian, is most illuminating if we see it from at least two perspectives, as a version of Leaves of Grass and as an interpretive act by Luigi Gambarelli, thoroughly shaped by his own outlook, politics, and historical moment. Adaptive reworkings of writers are worthy of consideration for similar reasons, whether it's Ken Kesey remaking Melville's Billy Budd and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or any number of filmmakers invoking Whitman to bring an extra erotic charge to a key scene. The remaking of Whitman in film, television programs, advertisements, and so forth is part of the ongoing life of the text. Tracking these adaptations provides insight into interpretive questions as well as the meaning of Whitman in the current moment. We currently present what is probably the only audio recording of Whitman, originally captured on a wax cylinder. In the future, we might well study its use, or perhaps better misuse, in a controversial Levi's commercial issued a couple of years ago. Such an analysis would venture far from traditional scholarly editing, but then we're not limited to what editions have done in the past. Whitman's afterlife offers new insight into his meanings in his own time, as well as in our own. All right, I'm going to return to that question of all, and what is all? And it's trickier than you might think. So the Walt Whitman Archive strives to achieve the most comprehensive treatment yet of Whitman's writings. Encompassing ever greater amounts of material is not without its own perils, since more information does not guarantee more illumination, and in fact, may risk for its creators organizational chaos and for its users a sense of being overwhelmed. Additionally, more may seem like less if there's a sense of diminishment. The proportion of first-rate work to dross declines with every laundry list, financial record, and stray doodle brought to light. Of course, you can argue this point the other way too and say that it's a testimony to the stature of Whitman that otherwise seemingly sane people would spend effort on material of questionable importance. Ed Folsom once remarked that the collected writings were in danger of becoming the discarded writings. Now, should Folsom and I worry that the Walt Whitman Archive could be seen as the peripheral writings, since we've included material such as his marginalia and his pre-leaves of grass newspaper fiction, not to mention the scribal documents I will discuss soon. How do we navigate the poles between relevance and irrelevance, order and chaos? Moreover, does order oversimplify material that is intrinsically messy? A famous image of Whitman surrounded by the debris of his papers. Amazing shot, I gotta say. We think of it as emblematic of the issues that are at the heart of his poetry, of his way of life, and of the ways we confront him. Whitman himself is liminal, caught between life and death, both the source and product of the papers around him. The medium of the photograph highlights our own activity in the creation of Whitman. How can we, or any editors, best make sense of all that clutter anyway? Many have attempted to extract a version of Whitman in hopes of getting the real thing, the essence. We try to honor the debris in the belief that there may be more truth in the fullness of the entire chaotic record than in any distillation of it. Our goal has been to treat as much Whitman material as possible, but is this a promise to edit all of Whitman? And if so, what does all entail anyway? For example, does the paragraph Whitman wrote at the end of John Burroughs' essay on birds and poets count as part of Whitman's writings? Does every mark on an article he read and saved, or mere underlinings in a book, constitute part of Whitman's writings? Some of this material is very slight indeed, a single mark on a newspaper clipping. Do we include it all, or does that way madness lie? Do we include only what is significant? And if so, who decides and on what basis is significance determined? We might initially be inclined to say no to marginalia until we encounter marginalia that is extensive, substantive, and even revelatory. These and related issues come into the foreground when we encounter what we call his scribal documents, the more than 3,000 documents he inscribed as a government clerk or secretary of the day, all of which raise complex questions of authorship and collaboration. I had the good fortune to identify these documents, written from 1865 to 1873, when he worked in the office of the Attorney General in Washington, D.C. They had been hiding in plain sight for 150 years in the vast sea of information that is the National Archives of the United States, currently housing more than 12 billion sheets of paper. Only a handful of the documents were signed or initialed by Whitman. And this is one of the rare ones that is, in fact, initialed by Whitman. You can see the WW in the left margin there. So my discovery of them relied on recognition of his handwriting. This seems all the more appropriate as the documents were preserved not because of Whitman's prominence as a poet, but because of his work as a clerk, a job that depended on a good hand. Still, for literary scholars, Whitman's years in the Attorney General's office coincided with his revising of Leaves of Grass and writing of Democratic Vistas, and these scribal documents can help us see how his roles as poet of democracy and clerk in bureaucracy were more entangled than we've ever known or imagined. In the Attorney General's office, work was accomplished through the bustle of collective effort. As the work of many hands, the scribal documents help adjust our view of textual production. These documents remind us to be wary of our intellectual habits, editorial history, and conventions of scholarship to the extent that they obscure the collaborative nature of literary production generally, and perhaps of Whitman particularly. As I've indicated, the New York University Press edition, the distinguished print predecessor of the Whitman Archive, all but erased the collaborative nature of many of Whitman's undertakings. Now, with this discovery of 3,000 scribal documents, we need to consider how best to treat Whitman-associated documents in which authorship is truly an open question. Most of the scribal documents are letters with all words, including the signature of another person, in Whitman's handwriting. These were internal office copies of letters typically going out over the name of the Attorney General or one of his assistants, though in one case we have a letter in Whitman's hand inscribed for President Andrew Johnson. Another 350 documents are letters written by other scribes that include Whitman's annotations. A few others are notes or summaries of index pages in Whitman's handwriting. For us at the Whitman Archive, all of these documents raise questions. Without doubt, these documents were once present in Whitman's mind and passed through his fingertips. Beyond that, we have uncertainty. For the scribal letters, Whitman probably acted sometimes as mere copyist and other times as co-author or even author. Whitman's occasional involvement in formulating documents, not just inscribing them, seems likely because we know his intellect and writing ability were valued by those in the office. In 1866, for example, Attorney General James Speed wrote to J. Hubley Ashton, his Assistant Attorney General, letting him know of plans to dedicate a bust of Abraham Lincoln in Speed's hometown of Louisville, Kentucky. Too busy to complete his speech, Speed asked Ashton to, quote, see our friend Walt Whitman and ask him whether he will take my rough draft of an address and revise and finish it. I have a notion that if he has the time and is in the mood, he can do it better than any man I know, unquote. As a group, the scribal documents bring into focus questions that are rarely highlighted by editors. What should the limits be in what we include in an expansive digital archive devoted to a prolific writer? And given that time, energy, and resources are always scarce, how should we prioritize our work? Should there be a distinction between Whitman's personal or literary writings and writing produced when he was an employee? Should we work on the scribal documents or spend time on, say, annotating Whitman's poetry? On the one hand, most people would say that the poetry is far more important than Whitman's work as a scribe. On the other hand, people have been annotating Whitman's poetry for more than a century, and much is already known about it. We decided to give the scribal documents high priority for various reasons. First, with help from a grant from the U.S. National Historical Publications and Records Commission, we've been working on Whitman's Reconstruction-era personal correspondence, and these scribal documents are mainly in the form of letters from the same time period, so they supplement and sometimes problematize our work on the personal correspondence in interesting ways. Second, when we edit Whitman, we typically aim to improve or add to earlier editorial efforts. It's fairly rare to have the chance to treat previously unknown material. For both editorial and broader scholarly reasons, then, we concluded we should make this material available at the earliest possible time through high-quality digital images and transcriptions, even before annotating the material, a task we plan to tackle as time allows. Most of the scribal letters were found in massive letter books, averaging over 900 pages each of large format, legal-sized paper. Ordinarily, at the Whitman Archive, we treat complete objects, for example, all leaves of a notebook rather than extracting the few lines of poetry that might be embedded within assorted addresses, doodles, observations, and accounts. We should consider what is gained and what is lost when only selected letters, all those in Whitman's hand, are photographed and transcribed and ultimately annotated. For us, that choice makes sense, though no doubt other scholars with broader interest in the Attorney General's office in these years would prefer a more inclusive approach. We too would acknowledge that, even from a Whitman-centered perspective, something is lost via our approach, specifically some information about Whitman's reading or possible readings of documents he had no hand in producing is not made available. We are limited by what's feasible given the available time and resources. Interestingly, in a case dealing with a murder in Dakota Territory, we can compare one of apparently several external copies with the internal office copy. The letters are nearly identical in semantic content, though they are visually quite distinct because they were written by two different scribes. This is one not written by Whitman, and this is the exact identical letter, word for word the same, slight punctuation differences, but you can see how visually different the two are. One was sent out into the world, eventually ended up on eBay, and I picked it up, and the other one was in the National Archives. The one that was sent out also has with it some illuminating contextual information not found with the office copy. It's unclear how many other documents in Whitman's handwriting might be found across the United States if a systematic search were to be conducted for the external or sent copies. That's for another lifetime, I think. Some documents are in the hands of another clerk, with Whitman only serving later to annotate in the margin. These catchphrases served as an indexing tool of sorts and helped render the books more useful. What is the status of these documents Whitman annotated? In an edition of an author's writings, they would not be included, but in a research environment like the Whitman Archive, with interest in what he wrote as an author and as a scribe, and also in what he read and knew, we face complicated questions of how best to treat such material. I would argue that we need to move beyond the boundaries we've inherited from print edition as we create research environments with our digital archives. We currently strive to maintain a distinction between Whitman writing on his own behalf and Whitman writing for others, but the distinction can be fraught because of the ambiguity of documents. One document in Whitman's handwriting on an envelope of the Attorney General's office says in its entirety, "Memoranda, pardon applicants, September 8 to 9, 1865. Also the Negro suffrage, also position of the president." The stationery might suggest that these are notes Whitman made to himself about work in the Attorney General's office. But are they, and how can we know? Perhaps they are notes about issues Whitman wanted to consider as he was composing Democratic Vistas. I draw attention to this document because of its liminal status. We cannot determine whether this is a literary or scribal document, a document written for Whitman's own purposes or for the purposes of others. As such, it challenges in a useful way the boundaries between literary and scribal documents. We've not yet given this document full editorial treatment, but it's likely to end up being represented twice in both Whitman's prose manuscripts and in the section on scribal documents, since it could belong to either category. In the space of the Attorney General's office, Whitman primarily functioned as a clerk, but in slack times and after hours, he also wrote letters to friends and family, conducted literary business, and pondered the future of democracy as he gazed through the large windows of the Treasury building in Washington, D.C. He was writing Democratic Vistas in these years, his meditation on the prospects for America, his attempt to be a sage akin to, say, Matthew Arnold and Thomas Carlyle in England. The vista for Democratic Vistas was here as he gazed out his windows facing to the south and to the west. Looking to the west, he could examine the prospects of the future, for these states tend inland and toward the western sea. I have an image of Washington, a bit like what he was seeing. Looking to the south, he could see across the river into blood-soaked Virginia, and he could muse on the devastation of the recent Civil War and the ongoing troubles of its aftermath, including the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, a recurrent topic in the scribal letters. It's remarkable, in fact, given the prominence of the Klan in the scribal documents, that Whitman is not more forceful and direct in responding to Thomas Carlyle's racist diatribe, Shooting Niagara, a text Democratic Vista sought to answer, but ultimately failed to do. Carlyle, you may remember, quote, lamented that 500,000 excellent white men full of gifts and faculty have torn and slashed one another into horrid death, and 3 million absurd blacks are completely emancipated, launched into a career of improvement, likely to be improved off the face of the earth. For Carlyle, extending the franchise in England was a bad idea, and the possibility of extending it to blacks in the U.S. was culturally suicidal, the equivalent of going over Niagara Falls in a barrel. In the Attorney General's office, Whitman was part of a network within the office, and beyond that led to collaborative production of both office and literary documents. In his particular office, Whitman was part of a small inner circle, but there were expanding rings of clerks and other bureaus and agencies in the city. This network of Washington clerks served to replace the group at Pfaff's Beer Hall, a bohemian hangout in New York, important to Whitman in the late 1850s and early 1860s. Whitman and his friends at Pfaff's had attracted scholarly attention in recent years, but his more staid Washington network has been neglected. That Washington network seems to me crucial to understanding how Whitman reconstructed his emotional and literary life after his unexpected move to Washington in 1863. We can glimpse the network in action in the case of a letter sent by the editor of The Galaxy, William Church, to William Douglas O'Connor. Church mentioned to O'Connor, a government employee and close friend of Whitman, that he should prompt the poet to write about the disbanding of the armies after the Civil War, a suggestion that led to the writing of Carol of Harvest. The second example can be found in the case of Whitman sending a copy of his Proud Music of the Sea Storm, published in the Atlantic Monthly in February 1869, to Julius Byng, who was a clerk of the Joint Select Committee on Retrenchment in 1867 and 1868. In response, Byng wrote a lengthy letter urging Whitman to write a poem about the Child Crusades. The poem was attempted by Whitman but never realized as such. This aborted poem has not received any critical commentary, but it's well worth study as a fascinating example of Whitman collaborating on a poem. Imagining a firm wall dividing areas of life for Whitman is misleading. At times, Whitman used his office address as his literary postal address, and he regularly worked in his office at night. The heat and lighting were important benefits. During his Washington years, Whitman's literary and clerical lives regularly occurred in the same physical locations, and no doubt out of related emotional and psychological circumstances. We might think of Reconstruction as a metaphor for Whitman's life, networks, writing, country, and even our own editorial labor. We are working out of a print tradition and trying to realize the possibilities of an expansive edition in a digital age. We are the new scribes of Whitman the Scrivener, engaged in work that can be both tedious and exhilarating. Thank you.
Thank you. We have plenty of time for Q&A, so open up the floor for questions.
Yes, Wendy Katz.
So what was his answer to Carlyle?
Oh man, it was an inadequate answer to Carlyle. He answers him evasively and in a footnote. And he says things like, you know, he grants him the dangers of extending suffrage, but he says, since we've gone so far, let's go all the way and break down all the barriers. Whether that implies extending the suffrage to women and to Native Americans is not clear. He doesn't say it explicitly, but what was at issue at the time was black suffrage for men. And he seems somewhat evasively, but to come down on the affirmative on that question. Other issues? Yeah.
How did you get into this field and study of Whitman? What led you to do that?
You know, a faculty member assigned me a paper. Honestly, you know, back in graduate school, I wrote a paper on Whitman, and was the first professor that ever said, "Oh, this is promising. I think if you revise this, it could be published." And I naively thought he meant revise it once. So I revised it for him, and he gave it back to me, all marked up just as much again. And I revised it again. And we went through that 6 times before he said, "Okay, you can send it out now." But the nice thing was that he'd gone through that labor, and then the first place I sent it to accepted it. It was a very nice way to start publishing, that I didn't have to get perused a million times the way a lot of people on their first attempt to get published. Anyway, I think more to answer you in a different way, I think what captivated me, what caught my attention about Whitman, and the subject that I was writing about was Whitman, Specimen Days, his autobiographical account. At the time, I didn't think I liked poetry very much. I was more comfortable with prose, and that was a way to avoid Whitman's poetry. And in Specimen Days, he gives these really moving accounts of tending to wounded soldiers in Civil War hospitals. So it's an amazing humanitarian effort on his part to capture me. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about the evolution of the digital project from a time before Google Books to
Right.
where it is now, and I just would love to hear a little bit more about some of those technical challenges. Like, what have you learned about how to sort of bank on obsolescence, or from a sort of digital project management perspective, how has being with a long-term project like this and seeing the way technology changes, how has that shaped the way you think about the work of the thing that you've created?
Yeah, that's a good and important question. Thanks, Jessica. The project started out in so-called HTML, and people back then were using something called SGML. HTML stands for Standard Generalized Markup Language, and HTML is what's behind what you see on most web pages. But for scholarly editions, these days people want you to use XML, Extensible Markup Language, and it's something that at least has the potential for interoperability, so that you could join together the Whitman Archive and Frederick Douglass's papers and Thoreau and Emerson and all the rest. We stumbled along for a while at the first 5 years of the project when I was at the College of William and Mary, and we were attempting to collaborate with the University of Virginia that had a really prominent digital center. But at a certain point, we got a first NEH grant, and about that time I was recruited to move to the University of Nebraska, and we made a determination that we were not going to put another thing up that was in HTML and that wasn't done in accordance with international standards for interoperability, and thus it would be both better for long-term maintenance and survivability of the project, and of course the granting agencies would like it better as well. Because this is a project that will be 25 years old this next year, it has the problems of aging, and the technology has been changing very rapidly, and we have built things with the best technology at the time. Like, for example, not right at the beginning, we were making some technical mistakes, but since 2000 we've been doing things the right way, but even so the technology keeps jumping ahead of us. And so you have something that to the external user looks kind of seamless and beautiful, but behind the scenes it can sometimes be a nightmare to maintain and inefficient to maintain. So we are actually applying for a grant right now that would help us, redo the guts of the project. And part of the problem is that granting agencies have been reluctant to fund that kind of thing because it doesn't seem sexy to them. They want new content out there to give to the public, because the public understands new content. They don't understand that you have to get under the hood and really make the car well constructed in order for it to live a decade or two. So anyway, does that get enough of?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just think, at the beginnings of digital projects, like, this is the thing that's a terror, right?
Yeah.
You can put years into something and then you have to figure out how to, I'm just thinking about the contrast between those books from the NYU Press, which have their own flaws,
Yeah.
and then the illusion that we can do a better job in digital editions because we can include everything, but we still have the problems of of the limits of the technology.
And we have to live with the terrible mystery and uncertainty of the fact that what if it all disappears in 5 years, or what, some like terrible electronic disaster, wipes things. So should you not do this because your time is valuable, you're devoting your whole life to something that could vanish? I mean, those are serious questions, and so I think people should think hard about it. On the other hand, the U.S. military, big corporations, lots of people have invested tons of money in things like XML, and so there are a lot of people with big vested interest in having this stuff survive. So, and the Library of Congress and many other worldwide organizations are working very, very hard on long-term preservation. So I think there are, more and more fail-safes and ways to reassure oneself. The other way to think about it is that it seems to me that in our time, if you're trying to address the kinds of questions that engage me, I mean, it's too exciting. It's too, like this is the experiment of our time. You've just got to do it. And if you fail, you fail. But you gotta go in there, right? Yeah.
Relatedly, it's incredible to think about deciding to make a digital project in 1995.
Yeah, that was really stupid. I know.
And I'd love to hear not how it evolved mechanically, but how it evolved conceptually. So I think it sounds like when you started, you just wanted to make all the different editions available. But I'm really curious about which layers came next and what your goals were as the internet developed.
Yeah, there are a whole lot of things that we didn't know when we started. I mean, one of the things that we thought we were producing was a resource for scholars. And what we didn't realize was that we'd be getting all kinds of letters from junior high school kids and from people in Korea and people everywhere, writing to us because this stuff is free and it's available and they're interested. And so, yeah, I mean, and I had a fifth grader who addressed me as the Walt Whitman poetry person and wanted me to adjudicate between her and a teacher in a dispute about what a poem meant. I tried to, be discreet as best I could, So yeah, finding out about that you had a world audience, that you weren't just working for scholars, and then how to think about how do you pitch that? I mean, we've had discussion. Do we have a Whitman Archive for high school students? Do we have layers of accessibility? But neither at Folsom nor I are inclined toward jargon, and so we just continued to kind of build this thing that we thought we were building in the first place. And it turns out that if you don't engage in a lot of jargon, that interested high school students and even junior high school students and younger, and people that have English as a second or third language can still work with it. You asked how it started and how it evolved in terms of its scope. I mean, a lot of the things that we've done, we didn't in any stretch foresee. I mean, we didn't know about the scribal documents that I talked about a fair amount. We didn't think about translation at all early on. We had no idea that 2 full-length books would be discovered in the last 8 years or so that would add to things. I don't think we initially were thinking about doing both sides of the correspondence, but the more we thought about it, it seemed obvious to do that. Yeah, I mean, it started at the College of William and Mary when a couple of MA students, and they were shutting down their MA program that year, and so there were going to be no graduate students to work with in the foreseeable future. They had just been to the University of Virginia, had visited the Institute for Advanced Technology and Humanities. They came back with glow in their eyes, and they said, let's do something really big on Shakespeare or something. No. And then, we talked a little bit more, and I, explained to them, about Whitman and the possibilities there. And University of Virginia has a very good Whitman collection. It's one of the, 4 or 5 best in the country. And they had, Jerry McGann, a leader, and thinking about these kind of things, and John Unsworth and various other people that you could consult with. And so it evolved that way. And then, yeah, I mean, it continued to take on new life as we also began to do the interacting with federal agencies and seeking grant funding. And so one of the key, to answer your question, one of the key changes that occurred in changing conceptualization had to do with how do you publish this and how do you pay for it. And early on, it was not at all clear that open access was for sure the way to go, because nobody had demonstrated that you could actually do that. And so publishers were interested, and so we were in late stages of negotiation with 2 different publishers on creating a for sale version of it so that we could get some revenue return that we could then reinvest in the project and build the project through some kind of revenue return. And fortunately, both of those failed. Ultimately, they were aborted for one reason or another. And because we said to ourselves, the choice is either that or succeeding in getting an endless string of grants for like a 25-year period. And we doubted we could do it. But in fact, and this is not to brag, but it's just a fact that we've had nonstop funding since 1997. And we've often had like 2 or 3 or even 4 grants going at once. So, now I think it's worth thinking about the implications of that. I mean, Whitman is particularly nicely positioned as being sort of, the poet of democracy. You can wrap the flag around him if you want. He can be edgy if you want. He can be kind of a Marxist if you want. He can be a gay icon if you want. Everybody can read him their own way, and he doesn't piss too many people off, partly because he got sanctified by all of the hospital, self-sacrificing. So, I mean, like, what if you wanted to do a project on a really important writer like Margaret Fuller? What are your chances of actually getting funding, since the first question the NIH asks is, significance, question mark. And you've got to make a case that they got a bunch of things, asking for funding, and you have to demonstrate that yours is the one that's most deserving. So I think there are real issues about the canon and the remaking of literature into digital form that are complicated. And the Whitman Archive, feels some responsibility from the fact that we've received a bunch of money and support, and we don't want to starve other projects. Now, how can we help other projects? And we've done what we could to partner with people, but it's complicated. And I mean, recently I've started work on Charles Chestnut, which is a sort of different kind of writer, and fortunately NEH bid on that, so that's really encouraging.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions?
Dean, I saw your hand.
Okay. A very brief generalist question. I've noticed that in the last couple of years, all my colleagues are turning to writers who wrote in times of crisis. So a lot of my peers are looking into Baldwin and Malcolm X, or looking at Hannah Arendt and Emma Goldman. And I wonder if you think of Whitman as somebody who we ought to also be turning to in our current time of crisis. Does your archive help us see him in some fresh way as writing, as deeply a man of his time, writing in moments of crisis? Is there anything you would want us to think about when we think about Whitman as writing in times of national crisis?
Yeah. I think people want to find in Whitman answers for the dilemmas and trauma of American experience, and when he doesn't answer for them, they feel betrayed, and and there are really disappointing things in Whitman. There are failures of vision. There are, there's a I just finished writing a chapter about this, and it's painful to write and troubling, but a sort of cross-racial identification seemed to power and enable the emergence of his early poetry, and was really terrific. Obviously it's complicated, and there's problems with potentially appropriation and other things, granted all of that. But for some, I don't know what it was, whether it was the fact of tending to tens of thousands of Civil War soldiers, whether he just became exhausted or whether, but he seemed to begin to lose the sympathy and concern for African Americans in particular in the later years. And so, yeah, I think I think Whitman is really rich material to address the very issues you're talking about, but it won't always be a happy story. What you might take a look at if you're interested in pursuing this in connection with Whitman is that there's a fantastic series that the North American Review has done this year. It's called Every Atom, and for the 200, they're posting 200 annotations on Song of Myself. And these are done by poets, critics, physicists, environmentalists, activists, dancers, all kinds of people, and they're saying the craziest, wildest, most insightful, eloquent, wonderful things. And some of them are really, you know, hitting him hard, and others are praising him to the rooftops, and it's quite enlightening.
Fantastic.
I have one more.
Students want to escape. Yeah.
I have a silly little question to close it out with. Every photo I've ever seen of Walt Whitman is that same old man photo with the beard and his red.
Oh, right.
Do you have an earlier picture of him?
Sure. They go back to as early as about 20 years old. One of the interesting things, yeah, there's some that like were taken when he was in New Orleans, and there's, you know, he's early on he was sort of aping sort of man about town, cane, you know, boutonniere, hat, you know, almost like a dandy. And then at a certain point he decided he was going to be, you know, writing as the man of the common people, and he takes on workman's garb in the famous 1855, you know, arm akimbo pose and a hat on the side of his head, and kind of looking challenging toward the reader. But yeah, no, there's about 140 known photos of Whitman. He's the most photographed American literary writer of the 19th century. Lived his life entirely in the 19th century. Mark Twain had more, but he lived into the 20th century. So it's how you can say it that way. I think Douglas might have had more photos though, because Douglas was also a magnet for the camera.
All right, well, please join me in thanking Ken.